The afternoon of November 20th, 1944, somewhere over Tokyo Bay at 31,000 feet, Staff Sergeant James Kolwalski peers through the targeting reticle of his upper gunner's sighting station aboard a B-29 Superfortress. The pressurized cabin hums with the steady drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each one generating 2,200 horsepower. Through the plexiglass blister, he spots them, 6 dark specks climbing hard from below, trailing thin contrails in the frozen stratosphere. Japanese fighters. Zeros, probably. Maybe key 44 seconds. At this distance, it doesn't matter. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. What matters is they're still 1,500 yards out and closing fast. Jim does something that would have been impossible in a B-17 or B-24. He doesn't wait for them to get closer. He doesn't hold his fire until he can see the meatball insignia on their wings. Instead, he centers his targeting reticle on the lead aircraft, holds it steady for 3 seconds, while the General Electric analog computer calculates range, closure rate, altitude correction, and ballistic drop, then squeezes the trigger. 4 Browning M2 machine guns in the upper forward turret, mounted 28 feet behind him but controlled remotely by his sighting station, open fire in perfect synchronization. 50 caliber rounds scream downrange at 2,900 feet per second. The Japanese pilots, still climbing hard and more than a quarter mile away, probably don't even know they're under fire yet. Then the lead Zero simply disintegrates. One moment it's a climbing fighter, the next it's tumbling debris and an expanding cloud of vaporized fuel igniting in the thin air. The remaining 5 fighters break formation immediately, scattering in every direction. 3 abort their attack entirely, diving back toward the cloud deck below. The other 2 attempt a high-side pass from Jim's 11 o'clock, but they're picked up by the right blister gunner, who hammers both of them with concentrated fire from 1,200 yards out. One takes hits across the engine cowling and peels off trailing white coolant smoke. The other keeps coming, but by the time it's close enough to fire its 20mm cannons, the B-29 has already moved on, maintaining its 340-mile-per-hour cruise speed at altitude, while the damaged fighter struggles to keep pace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't luck. This wasn't even exceptional gunnery. This was standard operating procedure by late 1944 for B-29 crews in the Pacific Theater, and it represented something the Japanese High Command had failed to anticipate when they first spotted Boeing's massive new bomber appearing in reconnaissance photographs over the Marianas in September of that year. The B-29 wasn't just bigger and faster than previous American bombers. It wasn't just capable of flying higher and carrying more ordnance. The Superfortress possessed a defensive fire control system so fundamentally advanced that it changed the basic mathematics of aerial interception in ways Japanese fighter tactics had never accounted for. Every Japanese fighter pilot trained in 1943 and early 1944 had learned the same doctrine. American bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that had ravaged German industry, could be engaged effectively at ranges of 300 to 400 yards. Get that close, use your superior maneuverability to avoid their fire, hit them hard with your nose-mounted armament, then break away before their dorsal or tail guns could track you properly. This doctrine worked, more or less. It cost Japanese pilots terrible casualties, even against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, whose manually aimed guns were formidable enough. But it worked because those bombers had predictable defensive envelopes. A gunner in a B-17's ball turret could hit targets out to maybe 600 yards on a good day with a trained crew. More typically, effective fire came at 400 yards or less. The guns themselves were capable of much more, but the human element, the need to manually track, manually lead, and manually correct for every variable from airspeed to windage, limited practical accuracy. The B-29 removed the human element from the equation. When Boeing's engineering team designed the Superfortress in 1940 through 42, they confronted a fundamental problem. The aircraft would fly at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet in a pressurized cabin to protect the crew from the brutal environment at that height. But machine gun turrets couldn't be pressurized without making them enormous, heavy, and defeating the entire purpose of high-altitude flight, which was to stay above effective anti-aircraft fire and beyond the reach of most fighters. The solution was elegant and revolutionary. Remove the gunners from the turrets entirely. 5 sighting stations were installed throughout the aircraft. The nose station, operated by the bombardier. The upper gunner station, positioned in a rotating ring behind the flight deck. 2 blister stations on either side of the rear fuselage. And the tail station, the only position where a gunner actually sat with his guns. These sighting stations weren't simple gun mounts. They were sophisticated fire control positions, each equipped with its own dedicated analog computer built by General Electric. When Jim Kolwalski aimed at that climbing zero formation, he wasn't just pointing a crosshair and pulling a trigger. The moment he placed his targeting reticle on the lead aircraft and held it steady, gyroscopes in his sighting station measured the target's relative velocity. Simultaneously, the navigator's panel fed critical data to his dedicated computer, indicated airspeed, barometric altitude, outside air temperature. The computer used this information to calculate the B-29's true airspeed and density altitude. Then it performed 3 critical corrections that no human gunner could calculate fast enough under combat stress. First, ballistics. A 50 caliber round leaving a Browning M2 at 2,900 feet per second doesn't travel in a straight line. Gravity pulls it down. At 600 yards, a standard engagement range for older bombers, that bullet drops roughly 7 feet. At 1,200 yards, the drop exceeds 28 feet. The computer knew this. It calculated the precise angle of elevation needed to compensate, then commanded the turret to aim high automatically. Second, deflection. The target was moving. The B-29 was moving. Both were moving through air that itself was moving at high altitude, with winds often exceeding 100 miles per hour. A crossing target at 1,200 yards, traveling 300 miles per hour, would move roughly 200 feet in the time it took the bullet to arrive. The computer calculated this lead automatically, commanding the turret to aim ahead of where Jim's sight picture showed the target. Third, parallax. Jim's sighting station sat nearly 30 feet away from the upper forward turret. The angle from his position to the target was different from the angle from the turret to the same target. This parallax error, negligible at close range, became significant at extended distances. The computer knew the exact geometric relationship between every sighting station and every turret, calculated the correction in real time, and adjusted aim accordingly. All of this happened faster than human thought. Jim aimed. The computer corrected. The turret fired. Total elapsed time from target acquisition to rounds downrange, under 3 seconds. But here's what made the system truly devastating for Japanese interceptors. Each sighting station could control multiple turrets. The nose gunner had primary control of both forward turrets, upper and lower. The upper gunner could access the upper forward turret and the upper aft turret. The blister gunners controlled the lower aft turret and could also access the tail guns if needed. The tail gunner controlled his own turret, but other stations could fire his guns remotely if he was incapacitated. This meant a single gunner, tracking a single target, could bring multiple turrets to bear simultaneously. 4 guns became 8. 8 guns became 12. The B-29 could concentrate defensive firepower in ways that no previous bomber had ever achieved. Japanese fighter tactics, built around the expectation of engaging American bombers at 300 to 400 yards, suddenly confronted an aircraft that could hit them accurately and hard at 1,200 yards, 3 times the distance they expected defensive fire to be dangerous. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. When the first B-29 raids began hitting targets in June of 1944, Japanese fighter units approached the bombers using standard doctrine, close to 400 yards, spray the formation with cannon fire, break away before the return fire gets too intense. The pilots who tried this discovered something terrifying. They were taking accurate, concentrated fire long before they reached their own effective weapons range. A Zero's 20mm cannon was lethal, but its effective range against a bomber was perhaps 400 to 500 yards. The 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the engine cowling were even shorter ranged, useful only inside 300 yards. Japanese pilots found themselves under fire from 1,200 yards out, with 8 or more 50-caliber guns tracking them through computer-assisted sighting, while they still had another 700 yards to cover before their own weapons could do meaningful damage. The mathematics were brutal. At 300 miles per hour, covering 700 yards takes roughly 4.5 seconds. 4.5 seconds of flying directly toward multiple turrets, firing 13 rounds per second per gun, with every round computer-aimed to lead your position. The beaten zone, the area where bullets were statistically likely to impact, wasn't spread randomly like manually aimed fire. It was concentrated, precise, and it moved with you as you maneuvered because the computers recalculated lead and deflection continuously. Pilots who survived the approach and managed to fire at the B-29 discovered another problem. The bombers' defensive fire didn't stop when they broke away. The turrets tracked them through their evasion maneuvers, maintained lead through rolls and dives, kept firing accurately as they tried to escape back to safe distance. Manually aimed guns would lose the target during aggressive evasion. The B-29's computer-controlled turrets simply adjusted and kept shooting. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force conducted analysis of the early encounters in July and August of 1944. The results were grim. Fighter units reported that standard attack profiles against B-29 formations were resulting in unsustainable casualties. Average loss rates per mission exceeded 12%, meaning a pilot had less than a 50% chance of surviving 8 missions. And unlike losses against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, where roughly half of shot-down fighters resulted from mutual combat, the overwhelming majority of losses against B-29 seconds came during the approach phase, before Japanese pilots could bring their weapons to bear effectively. The altitude problem compounded everything. The B-29's service ceiling exceeded 33,000 feet. Most Japanese fighters, including the vaunted Zero, had service ceilings around 33,000 feet on paper. But combat ceiling, the altitude at which an aircraft could still maneuver and fight effectively, was typically 3,000 to 5,000 feet lower. At 28,000 feet, a Zero was near its performance limit. Controls became mushy. Rate of climb dropped to barely 200 feet per minute. Acceleration was anemic. The B-29, meanwhile, was in its element. It cruised comfortably at 30,000 feet, often higher. When it came time to bomb, many formations would actually descend to 25,000 feet for improved bombing accuracy, then climb back up immediately after dropping ordnance. This created a tactical nightmare for Japanese air defense. Radar stations would detect incoming raids, but the early warning systems couldn't accurately determine altitude. Fighter units would scramble from ground level, climbing as fast as their engines could manage. From sea level to 20,000 feet took a good fighter approximately 6 minutes. From 20,000 to 30,000 feet took another 6 to 8 minutes, and by the time they reached that altitude, they were approaching stall speed, nearly out of fuel from the aggressive climb, and still accelerating toward combat velocity. The B-29 formations, detected early by Japanese radar, would often be overhead their targets before defending fighters reached interception altitude, and when fighters did manage to get high enough, they discovered they were too slow, too sluggish, too close to their performance limits to effectively engage bombers cruising at 340 miles per hour and defended by computer-controlled guns that could hit them from a quarter-mile away. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring fighter aces with over 60 confirmed kills, attempted to intercept B-29 seconds over Tokyo in November of 1944. His after-action report, captured after the war, described the experience. "We climbed for 15 minutes to reach the bomber altitude. My Zero was shaking, struggling in thin air. I could barely hold formation with my wingmen. When we finally reached the Americans, they were already turning for home. I attempted a stern attack on a straggler, approaching from below and behind. At roughly 800 meters, I saw tracers. They were firing at me, precise, walking toward my aircraft. I broke left immediately and had to dive away. My wingman pressed the attack. He exploded before firing a single shot. Sakai survived the war, one of the few Japanese pilots who could make that claim after flying air defense over the home islands. In post-war interviews, he stated bluntly that attacking B-29 seconds was suicide without purpose. The bombers could see you coming from distances. Japanese fighters couldn't effectively return fire. Their defensive guns were aimed by machines that didn't panic, didn't lose track of targets during evasive maneuvers, and didn't make the human errors that allowed clever pilots to exploit gaps in manual gun coverage. The Japanese Army Air Force tried everything. They experimented with different approach angles, head-on attacks, where closure rates were highest, and gave gunners the least time to track targets. Diving attacks from high altitude, using gravity to build speed beyond what the fighters could achieve in level flight. Massed formations, hoping to saturate the defensive fire and overwhelm the B-29's crew. Nothing worked consistently. Head-on attacks put fighters directly in the fire cone of the forward turrets, which had 8 guns in later B-29 models. The computers calculated deflection for head-on shots just as easily as they did for beam or stern attacks. Diving attacks gave B-29 crews advance warning and time to concentrate multiple turrets on a single target. Massed formations just meant more targets for the defensive gunners, and the General Electric Fire Control System allowed a single gunner to rapidly switch between multiple threats, something impossible with manually aimed weapons. By December of 1944, Japanese fighter tactics against B-29 raids had deteriorated into desperation. Specialized ramming units were formed, pilots, volunteers who would deliberately crash their fighters into bombers when ammunition ran out or guns jammed. From August 1944 through the end of the war, ramming attacks destroyed 9 B-29 seconds and damaged 13 others. The cost: 21 fighters and their pilots. That's a loss exchange ratio of more than 2 to 1 in favor of the bomber, and that's counting only successful ramming attacks. Failed ramming attempts, where the pilot was shot down before closing to ramming distance, numbered in the hundreds. The B-29's defensive firepower was so overwhelming that even deliberately suicidal tactics failed more often than they succeeded. The effective range of the system, that 1,200-yard envelope where computer-assisted fire was accurate enough to reliably damage or destroy attacking fighters, represented something unprecedented in aerial warfare. For context, 1,200 yards is 7/10 of a mile. Picture a fighter pilot attempting to close that distance while under fire from multiple turrets, each turret housing 250 caliber machine guns, each gun firing 13 rounds per second, every round computer-aimed to arrive at the exact point in space where your aircraft will be when the bullet gets there. The physics were simply insurmountable for technology available to Japan in 1944 and 1945. The fire control computers, built by General Electric using analog electromechanical relays, represented the cutting edge of computing technology at the time. Each sighting station had its own dedicated computer, housed in a steel case 3/8 of an inch thick and weighing over 50 pounds. Inside, gears, relays, vacuum tubes, and mechanical calculating elements that could perform ballistic calculations faster than any human gunner. These weren't electronic digital computers in the modern sense. They were analog machines, using physical motion of components to model mathematical relationships. Turn a dial to input target range, and mechanical elements inside the computer physically moved to positions representing the ballistic solution for that range. Input altitude and airspeed, and other elements adjusted to account for air density and relative velocity. The output, electrical signals controlling the turret positioning motors, was continuously updated as inputs changed, meaning the guns stayed on target even as the tactical situation evolved second by second. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese bombers like the G-4M Betty and the G-5N Renzan had manually aimed guns in manually operated turrets. Their defensive fire was as good as the individual gunner's skill, limited by human reaction time, human calculation speed, and human endurance at high altitude in unpressurized aircraft. Japanese fighters, attacking American B-29 formations, found themselves facing technology that their own military-industrial complex was years away from developing. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The disparity wasn't just in the fire control system. The B-29 carried 12 50 caliber machine guns in most configurations. Early models had a 20mm cannon in the tail, though this was removed in later variants due to ammunition incompatibility with the machine guns. The defensive ammunition load was staggering, over 10,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across all turrets and positions. For comparison, a standard B-17G Flying Fortress carried 13 50 caliber guns, but they were manually aimed, and the total ammunition load was roughly 5,000 rounds. A B-24 Liberator had 10 guns and a similar ammunition load. The B-29 matched or exceeded their armament and more than doubled their ammunition and capacity, all while integrating it into a computer-controlled system that made every round exponentially more likely to hit its target. The Japanese Zero, the fighter that had dominated Pacific air combat in 1941 and 1942, was fundamentally outmatched. Its two 20mm cannons carried 60 rounds each. Its two 7.7mm machine guns had 500 rounds each. Total weight of fire per second, roughly 7 pounds. The Zero was built light, with minimal armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks, to maximize maneuverability and range. This made it extraordinarily vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. A single solid hit from a 50 caliber round could puncture the fuel tank and ignite the aircraft. 3 or 4 hits were usually fatal. The B-29's defensive system could put out 65 pounds of projectiles per second when all guns were firing. Even a short burst, 2 or 3 seconds of fire, meant 195 pounds of metal screaming down range. If even 5% of that found the target, it was more than enough to destroy any fighter Japan could field. And the computer-assisted sighting meant the hit rate was far higher than 5%. Gunner training manuals from late 1944 stated that trained crews should expect hit rates exceeding 20% on crossing targets at optimal range. That's not 20% of rounds hitting the aircraft. That's 20% of bursts achieving hits. Given that a typical burst was 40 to 50 rounds, a 20% hit rate meant 8 to 10 50 caliber bullets, striking the target for every engagement where the gunner achieved proper tracking. No fighter could survive that. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications cascaded through the entire Pacific War's final year. B-29 operations from the Marianas, which began in earnest in November of 1944, were initially planned to require fighter escort, just like B-17 and B-24 missions over Europe required P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts to protect them. But by January of 1945, mission planners realized the escorts weren't necessary. The B-29 seconds were protecting themselves. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, made a calculated gamble in March of 1945. He stripped most of the defensive armament from his B-29 seconds, removing all turrets except the tailgun. The weight savings allowed the bombers to carry more ordnance and more fuel, extending their range and increasing their destructive capacity. This modification was possible specifically because Japanese fighter opposition had proven unable to effectively engage even fully armed B-29 seconds. Without guns entirely, operating at night when Japanese night fighter capabilities were nearly non-existent, the B-29 force could devastate cities with incendiary bombs while suffering minimal losses. The firebombing campaigns against Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other major cities in March through August of 1945 killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed massive swathes of Japan's industrial capacity. These raids were possible because the B-29's defensive systems had already broken the back of Japanese air defense. When asked after the war about the most significant technological advantage the Allies held in the Pacific, several captured Japanese officers specifically cited the B-29's fire control system Not the atomic bombs, not radar, not even American industrial capacity. The computerized guns. The technology didn't end with World War II. The Central Fire Control System, developed for the B-29, became the foundation for every American bomber defense system that followed. The B-36 Peacemaker, the massive 10-engine strategic bomber that entered service in 1948, used an improved version of the same system. The B-47 Stratojet and B-52 Superfortress, jet bombers of the Cold War era, incorporated evolved fire control computers that traced their lineage directly to the B-29's GE system. Modern military fire control, from air defense systems to naval gun mounts to tank targeting computers, all employ variations of the same fundamental principles. Measure target velocity, calculate deflection, correct for ballistics, adjust for parallax, execute automatically, faster than human thought. The Phalanx close-in weapons system, defending U.S. Navy warships since 1980, fires 75 20mm rounds per second at incoming missiles, with radar-controlled targeting that calculates the same ballistic solutions the B-29's computers performed in 1944. The system is exponentially more sophisticated, using digital processors and radar guidance, but the core concept, removing human limitations from the firing solution calculation, is identical. In video games that simulate aerial combat, players encounter the same physics. Lead moving targets, compensate for bullet drop, account for relative velocity. Simulator games like Digital Combat Simulator and War Thunder require players to learn these principles manually, giving them a visceral understanding of what bomber gunners in World War II confronted. The difference is that B-29 gunners had computers doing the calculation for them. Their job was just to keep the target centered in the reticle and pull the trigger. The lesson from the B-29's defensive system extends beyond technology. It's a lesson about the exponential advantage gained when machines handle tasks that exceed human cognitive bandwidth. A trained human gunner could hit targets at 600 yards with manual aim if conditions were perfect and the target cooperated. A machine, performing the same task with computer assistance, could hit targets at 1,200 yards consistently, regardless of conditions, regardless of how aggressively the target maneuvered. Japanese pilots weren't less skilled than American gunners. Japanese fighter aircraft weren't inherently inferior to American bombers. But Japanese pilots were trying to engage targets protected by a system that made human skill irrelevant. You can't outfly mathematics. You can't outmaneuver physics. When the calculation of where to aim is handled by a machine that never hesitates, never gets tired, and never makes errors from stress or fear, human courage becomes insufficient. The Zero pilots diving toward B-29 formations over Tokyo weren't cowards for breaking off their attacks when defensive fire started tracking them from 1,200 yards. They were rational actors recognizing an unsolvable problem. You can't close 700 yards under computer-controlled fire. The machine will hit you long before you reach your own weapons range. That's not a failure of skill or will. It's a failure of technology parity. Japan's military leadership understood this. Documents recovered after the war show Imperial headquarters requesting urgently that their own aircraft industry develop remote-controlled defensive gun systems for Japanese bombers. Engineers estimated such a system could be in service by late 1946. The war ended before those plans could be implemented. The B-29 crews who flew missions over Japan in 1944 and 1945 understood they had an advantage. Many didn't fully understand how significant that advantage was, or precisely why their defensive fire was so much more effective than previous bombers. They knew their guns hit targets at longer range. They knew the Japanese fighters seemed reluctant to press attacks once defensive fire started. They credited their training, their crew coordination, their aircraft's ruggedness. All of that mattered, certainly. But what mattered most was physics executed by machines, ballistic calculations performed by analog computers, targeting solutions implemented faster than human neurons could fire. The computers didn't care about fear. They didn't worry about family back home, about whether they'd survive the mission. They just calculated trajectories and moved gun turrets, again and again, mission after mission, until Japanese air defense over the home islands collapsed entirely. By August of 1945, when the Enola Gay carried the first atomic bomb to Hiroshima, Japanese fighter interception was so degraded that the bomber flew without escort and without defensive armament beyond the tail guns. The fire control system that could have protected it wasn't needed. There was nothing left in Japanese air defense capable of threatening a B-29 at altitude. The revolution in defensive gunnery, born from Boeing's requirement for a pressurized bomber and General Electric's solution of remote turrets, changed aerial warfare permanently. It proved that the right technology, properly implemented, could overcome numerical superiority, superior pilot skill, even superior aircraft performance. It proved that wars are won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the side that solves technical problems faster and implements solutions more effectively. And it proved, to the Japanese pilots who survived those desperate interception attempts over their burning cities, that courage alone is not enough when physics is against you. The records from the 73rd Bombardment Wing, stationed on Saipan, tell a story in numbers that Japanese air commanders would have found impossible to believe before they experienced it firsthand. Between November 1944 and March 1945, the 73rd flew 209 missions over the Japanese home islands. During those missions, their B-29 seconds reported 11,026 separate fighter attacks. The gunners claimed 714 enemy aircraft destroyed, 456 probable kills, and 770 damaged. Japanese records, which are incomplete but more conservative, confirm at least 380 fighters lost to B-29 defensive fire during this period. The loss rate was catastrophic, not because Japanese pilots weren't pressing their attacks, but because pressing attacks against B-29 formations had become a near-certain death sentence. For context, the 8th Air Force in Europe, flying B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds over Germany during the same period, reported similar numbers of attacking enemy fighters but significantly lower kill ratios. The difference wasn't pilot skill or bravery, it was the fire control system. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, a right blister gunner on a B-29 named City of Los Angeles, kept a detailed diary of his missions. His entry from December 3, 1944, describes an engagement that illustrates how dramatically the system changed defensive gunnery. We were hit by 8 fighters, looked like Hayatis, coming in from our 3 o'clock high. I picked up the leader at maybe 1,400 yards, watched him through the sight for maybe 2 seconds while the computer locked on, fired a 3-second burst, saw strikes on his wing route. He rolled inverted and went straight down, never fired a shot at us. His wingman kept coming. I shifted to him, another burst. No visible strikes, but he broke off hard left and dove away, trailing smoke. The whole engagement lasted maybe 15 seconds, used about 80 rounds total. Back in stateside training, they told us we'd need 200 rounds to down a fighter if we were lucky. The computer makes you lucky every time. Morrison survived the war. He flew 35 missions and was credited with 6 confirmed kills and 3 probables. His ammunition expenditure per kill averaged 93 rounds. For comparison, B-17 gunners in Europe averaged over 400 rounds per kill. The difference was computational accuracy, but the system wasn't perfect, and understanding its limitations reveals why the Japanese were never able to exploit them effectively. The General Electric fire control computers were analog electromechanical devices, complex assemblies of gears, relays, and vacuum tubes. They were remarkably reliable for 1944 technology, but they could malfunction. A damaged relay, a loose connection, a vacuum tube failure could disable an entire sighting station's computing capability. When that happened, the affected turrets reverted to manual control, requiring the gunner to aim and fire without computer assistance. Japanese intelligence officers knew this. Captured documents from late 1944 show that Imperial headquarters issued tactical directives, instructing fighter units to concentrate on damaging B-29 seconds early in their approach, hoping to knock out fire control systems before the main engagement. The theory was sound. In practice, it was impossible to implement. To damage a B-29's fire control components, you had to hit the aircraft. To hit the aircraft, you had to get close enough to fire accurately. To get close, you had to survive the approach through computer-controlled defensive fire. The circular logic was inescapable. Some Japanese pilots did succeed in damaging B-29 seconds severely enough to degrade their defensive systems. But even a damaged B-29, with multiple sighting stations and redundant control pathways, could often route control of turrets to functioning stations and maintain effective defensive fire. The system was designed with redundancy specifically to prevent single-point failures from leaving the bomber defenseless. The tail gunner position was the only one where the gunner sat directly with his weapons, like traditional bomber positions. This was partly because the tail was the most common attack vector for fighters, requiring a dedicated position, and partly because putting a gunner in the tail provided a backup to the remote system. If all the computers failed, if all the sighting stations were knocked out, the tail gunner could still defend the aircraft manually. Late-war B-29 variants, the B-29B models used for low-level incendiary raids, removed all defensive armament except the tail turret. But even that stripped-down tail position retained computer assistance. The APG-15B radar fire control system, installed in B-29Bs starting in January 1945, gave tail gunners radar-directed fire control. The system could detect approaching fighters, lock onto them automatically, and compute firing solutions without the gunner even seeing the target visually. Night fighters approaching from the rear, invisible in the darkness, would suddenly find themselves under accurate fire guided by radar they didn't know the Americans possessed. Several Japanese night fighter pilots reported in debriefs that they'd been fired upon by B-29 tail gunners in conditions where visual acquisition should have been impossible. They were right. It was impossible. The radar was doing the seeing for the gunner. The psychological impact of this technology on Japanese fighter pilots cannot be overstated. In 1942 and 43, Japanese pilots had fought American aircraft with the confidence that their training, their experience, and their aircraft's capabilities gave them a fighting chance. Zeros could outturn Wildcats. Ki-43 Hayabusas could outclimb P-40 Warhawks. Even when American aircraft had advantages in speed or firepower, Japanese pilots could often leverage their strengths to achieve favorable outcomes. Against the B-29, there was no favorable outcome. The war ended not with Japanese surrender to superior courage, but to superior mathematics. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's air defense had already been destroyed, not by overwhelming numbers, but by a technology gap they could never close. The B-29's fire control system represented the future of warfare, the moment when machines began making life-and-death decisions faster and more accurately than human beings ever could. The Japanese pilots who died trying to intercept those silver bombers weren't defeated by better pilots or braver crews. They were defeated by General Electric computers that calculated ballistic trajectories in fractions of a second, by analog machines that could track a target through violent maneuvers without losing focus, by a system that made 1,200 yards feel like point-blank range. Staff Sergeant James Kolwalski, the gunner who opened this story, survived the war. He flew 28 missions over Japan and was credited with 4 confirmed kills. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he spoke about the experience with a mixture of pride and discomfort. "We had an unfair advantage," he said. "Those Japanese pilots were brave." But brave doesn't matter when you're getting shot at by a computer from a quarter mile away. They never had a chance. He was right. They never did. The legacy of that unfair advantage lives on in every computer-aimed weapon system in service today. From Patriot missiles defending against ballistic threats to phalanx guns protecting warships to targeting pods on fighter jets, the principle remains unchanged. Machines aim better than humans when speed and precision matter most. The Japanese pilots who climbed into their cockpits, knowing they faced 1,200 yards of computer-controlled fire, taught us something essential about modern war. Technology doesn't just provide advantages, it determines outcomes. Courage, skill, and determination cannot overcome physics, and when one side solves the problem of accurate automated fire control, while the other side still relies on human gunners squinting through iron sights, the outcome isn't in doubt. The 850 caliber guns that destroyed Zeros from 1,200 yards away weren't just weapons. They were mathematics, made lethal, physics, weaponized, computation turned into survival. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.